It's so good to be with you. We miss you here, as Josh said just a minute ago. And not too long, we're going to all be in this space together. Well, if you're just joining us, we're in a series that we've titled The Way of Jesus. And it's a series on spiritual formation. And if you're wondering, what is spiritual formation? Spiritual formation is this. It's the process and the pursuit of becoming more and more like Christ. And so that's what we've been looking at in this series. Paul, when he talks about this pursuit in the Bible of becoming more and more like Christ, he says it like this. He says, put on Christ, which is so interesting. This is in Ephesians 4. He says, take off your old self, take that off. That's the old you. And put on your new self, which is in the image of Christ. So he says, put on Christ. Maybe this works as an analogy to help you remember this. So my sons and I, during this quarantine, 40 days and nights of quarantine, we have been starving for sports. And finally, with the NFL draft, we had something to sink our teeth in. And so Thursday night, if you were watching, the number 8 pick came around to the Arizona Cardinals, and we took Isaiah Simmons, who is a beast out of Clemson. He's a linebacker named the Butkus NCAA linebacker of the year this last season. He has 3 ACC rings, 2 national championship rings. But here's what Isaiah has to do. He has to, if he's going to play for the Cardinals, he has to take off that Clemson jersey, leave it in South Carolina. It's orange anyway, like pumpkin orange. Who needs that? And then when he gets here, he gets to put on a Cardinal jersey. And then when training camp comes around, they'll give him a game helmet. And then in 9 months from now, he's going to be taking off those ACC rings and those national championship rings and putting on a Super Bowl ring. Oh yeah, you watch this. Thank you, Steve Keim. He's building a dynasty here. We have DeAndre Hopkins, we've got Kyler Murray, we have Fitz, and now we have Isaiah Simmons. It's going to be a good year. My point is, you see how even as a player changing teams, coming to a new team, he has to leave the college behind him. You can't play college ball forever. And Paul says it's the same with us. Take off your old self and put on Christ. So as we talk and today about these spiritual practices, I want you to see that it's a process of taking things off and putting things on to become more and more like Christ. Dallas Willard, who's one of my favorite spiritual formation thinkers, he talks about how many Christians have what he describes as magical thinking. He said they think if they just know enough about the Bible, read enough books about the Bible, that eventually, and believe those things, which is important, then that changes them spiritually. He says, no. He says, you have to practice it. You have to actually do these things like Christ did. There are ways that we live out our faith. I'll use this as an example. Let's say you want to become a world-renowned chef. Well, you can read books about cooking. You can watch YouTube videos about cooking. You can take classes on the culinary arts. But until you take a pan and put the ingredients in and start to mix up the sauce and put it on the fire, then you really, until you start to practice it, you can't become a cook. It's the same way spiritually, we have to practice it. So in this series on the way of Jesus, we've been talking about 5 different aspects of our spirituality, of our spiritual formation. We talked the first week about how there's an intellectual component, a cognitive component. And then Byron preached about how there is an affective aspect, a heart aspect to our faith. And he talked about prayer. And then Nathan Hughes last Sunday talked about how we form spiritually through our relationships, that there's a social or relational aspect to our faith. Today, I want to talk about how there's a volitional, a doing, a physical component to our spirituality. You see, we live in physical bodies. We live in a very physical world. And sometimes we think there's a dichotomy between our spiritual life and our physical life. And I want to say no, that the things we do physically And the actions we take, they have spiritual implications. So that's what we're going to be looking at as we go into this text. So in this series, we've been using parables of Jesus, and we come to a parable of Jesus where he talks about simplicity and austerity and slowing down. And I think he touches on some things that all of us are experiencing during this quarantine season. And I want us to look at this parable with fresh eyes and look at how we can take some of the things we're going through now and turn them into lifelong sustainable habits. So if you have a Bible at home, grab it or grab your phone and go to an app or your iPad. We're going to be in Luke chapter 12, verse 15. Then Jesus said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Verse 18, then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I'll store up my excess or my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." So what is Jesus teaching us? What can we learn from this parable? I want to give you in this teaching time right now 3 quarantine challenges, okay? So if you have a pen, get ready, write them down because we're going to cover a lot of ground. And the first quarantine challenge that I want to give you from this text is this: to embrace scarcity. Now, we're living in a time of scarcity. Maybe you haven't ever thought much about scarcity, but we are certainly in a season of scarcity. Scarcity means that any resource is in short supply. You're running out of it. And Jesus tells us this story, not about scarcity, but he talks about overabundance and stockpiling. And really, underneath all of that is this need to embrace scarcity. The thing is, we don't like scarcity. Scarcity frightens us. But scarcity, I don't know how much you know about it, but it's a basic economic principle. Because underneath everything that college professors teach on economics is the idea of scarcity. In Econ 101, usually the first class of the semester is spent dealing with scarcity, because from scarcity, you talk about supply and demand. You talk about the price of goods. You talk about where the goods are needed. All of that is based on scarcity. But like I said, we don't like scarcity, and it frightens us. There was a news crew. I saw a news piece a couple of weeks ago from Italy, and there was a camera crew in a grocery store showing us the empty shelves that we all have grown accustomed to here. We're not, in our country, we're not used to scarcity, are we? And so this Italian man is standing there looking at the empty shelves, and he says, "There's no pasta." He's in Italy, and there's no pasta in Italy. He says, listen, even during the Great Depression, there was pasta. Even during World War II, there was pasta, but right now we have no pasta. As a kid growing up, I knew a lot about scarcity, and I didn't like it. You've heard me say my parents were missionaries. As a missionary kid, it seemed like we never had enough of anything. I remember one birthday, true story. My twin brother and I opened our presents. It's like our 10th birthday, and we each got a pair of socks and our harmonica. And we're like, geez, Mom and Dad, I know we live in the jungle, but this. And they tried to explain that when we had been in the city, they had bought us gifts and someone broke into the car and stole our presents. And so they had to go shopping in the big village nearby. And we got harmonica and socks because of the scarcity of birthday presents in the jungle. I wasn't too happy about that. But I want to challenge you with this, to embrace it. I think there's 2 ways we can handle scarcity. One, we can either respond to it by accumulating and stockpiling, just like this man does in the story. And we can fill our pantries, we can fill our garages, we can fill our closets with all kinds of things. That's one way to protect ourselves from scarcity. Or embrace it And as Jesus goes on to say here, and I want you to go back to our text of verse 22, he says, instead of stockpiling, trust God with tomorrow. Look at this, verse 22. Don't worry about scarcity, he's saying. For life is more than food, and your body more than clothing. Look at the ravens. They don't plant or harvest or store food up in barns, but your God feeds them. And you are far more valuable than the birds of the air. So embrace scarcity. So I said grab a pen because with each of these quarantine challenges that I want to give you in this message, I want to follow it up with a practice. So if the challenge is to embrace scarcity, then the challenge, then the practice, then the need is to practice contentment. And I don't know if you've thought much about contentment, but I think contentment is the answer to scarcity. In verse 18, we read, then the man said to himself, I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store up my excess grain, my surplus grain. So the problem here is a lack of contentment. He looks at his barns, and this man is like, oh, they're too small. They can never hold everything that I need. Bob down the street, he has bigger barns. In fact, he has enough room for a big screen in his garage and a couch in his barn and his couch. You know, that's what he's thinking. Because of his lack of contentment, he starts to pile up and stockpile. What is excess? I said that this guy was living in excess. Excess is any time we have more than enough. It's a state of having more than enough. And if we're honest with ourselves, in our society, we usually have more than enough. But here's the problem. We don't need more than enough. And we will never be content until we answer the question, how much is enough? Maybe you've never answered that question. And maybe that's the most pressing question for our generation of Christians is how much is enough? Because if you don't answer that question, how much is enough, then you'll never be content. You can't be content until you've drawn the line and you know where enough is. There's an old Japanese proverb that goes something like, you can sleep in a room with 1,000 mattresses, but you can still only sleep on one mattress, and they're right. And so how much is enough? The invitation is to practice contentment. Contentment is the art of counting your blessings. I've heard it said that envy is the art of counting someone else's blessings. Envy is the enemy of contentment. Envy will always tell you don't have enough and you always need more. But the spiritual practice is contentment and to embrace scarcity. The key to contentment is opening our eyes to see that God already has lavished on us more than enough. And even in this quarantine season, can I invite you to do this? Later today, would you take a moment and make a list of your blessings, count them, and pursue contentment? All right. So that was our first quarantine challenge, embrace scarcity. Here's the second quarantine challenge. Embrace solitude. Maybe you've never spent so much time in your house before in your entire life. But we've been in solitude, for 40 days and 40 nights. But in many ways, maybe you've thought it was a curse. But in many ways, it's an opportunity for God to grow you. Because when you read the Bible, you see that person after person in the scripture, God sends them out on their own in solitude for 40 days in order to grow them spiritually. You look at Noah, and he's sent out on a boat. He's quarantined in a boat for 40 days with a bunch of pets. But God uses it to shape him. Moses goes on Mount Sinai in Egypt for 40 days and nights, and God shapes him. Even Jesus, we read, goes out into the wilderness, out in for this season of solitude in order to be ready for the ministry that God is calling him to. Maybe this has been right now your 40 days of solitude. And like I said a moment ago, don't see it as a curse, but maybe it's a blessing. Maybe this is God's time to shape you. Even Jesus, when he was here on earth, he would get run ragged by the busyness of doing ministry. And his response was to find places of solitude. Turn back a few pages in your Bible. I want to look at Mark. In Mark chapter 1, we read this. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. And then immediately Simon and his companions went to look for him. And when they found him, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." That's how busy it was. It got so busy. And if you turn a couple of pages over to Matthew 6, verse 31, we read, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. So even Jesus needed to embrace solitude. So my challenge to you is to, rather than resent solitude, is to embrace solitude. When I was a college pastor in Wheaton, the incoming freshmen many of them would tell me about their 2 weeks at Honey Rock. Not all the students had to do it. It was optional, but they could choose to go to this camp in northern Wisconsin for 2 weeks of what is called Passage. And it was a time really of spiritual formation. And during Passage, the leaders would take them out on this small lake, it's called Long Lake, and take them around the lake and spread the students out one at a time about a half a mile apart. And they would leave them there for 4 days, only with their Bible. And the students were invited to embrace solitude. College freshmen, incoming freshmen, have never spent so much time alone. No, there was no phones, no YouTube, no Fortnite, nothing. Just the Bible and prayer and solitude and time with God. And so many of them, as I talked to them about their time at Honey Rock, they said it shaped them, it changed them. God uses those moments of solitude to change us. So I share that with you so that when we go back to our normal life, you don't start running yourself so ragged again with all the busyness and all the important things that you have to do. And you find times and places of solitude. I don't know if you've heard this, but the number one place where Christians pray is in their car. That's how busy we are. The number two place where Christians pray is in the shower. The social scientist Robert Levine, he has a book titled A Geography of Time. And he writes about how important time is to us in our society. And he says scientists have found the shortest measure of time known to humanity. It's the space of time between when the stoplight turns green and the Yahoo behind you starts to honk. That's what it is. We're all that busy. We can't take it. I'm reaching back years, quite a few years ago. We were on vacation with our family, and we left our 4 sons with a babysitter. And when we came back, the babysitter meets us at the door, and she's so upset. She said, "Your youngest son," he was like 6 or 7 at the time, she said, "he called 911 and the police came." And so we gave her an extra tip, and after she left, we apologized. We sat around, we said, "Why did you call 911? He says, "Dad, I was bored." It's a crime. It's a crime in our country to get bored. That's how busy and hurried we are. But this season has taught all of us to slow down. We've learned that we can make it, we can survive without hurrying and rushing so much. Last Sunday, Josh Havens talked about this period. He said some are calling it the Great Pause, and it is. I've never seen so many families out for walks together of all ages, so many families riding bikes. Maybe you've never in your entire life or your kid's life had so much time in your home with them. And maybe they're driving you nuts just a little bit, but embrace it. Maybe this is the only time that your teenagers have actually had real conversations with you. But my point is that God is using that. Embrace it. In Mark chapter 31, Jesus says, or 6:31, "Come away with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." That's why I say embrace solitude. And with that, if the need is to embrace solitude, then the practice is contemplation. The need is for us to become contemplative Christians. If you have a place of solitude and you have time alone with God, then I want to invite you to become the contemplative Christian. Maybe you've never thought that you could be that kind of Christian, but I want to say, yes, you can. And maybe even right now during this quarantine time, you've found places of solitude in your garage or in a shop or in your office or in your she shed. Can I invite you to make those spaces your time and your place for contemplation, which involves prayer, meditation, reflecting on Scripture, listening to God? That's how you become a contemplative Christian. I think in this world, I could say there's basically two kinds of people. You know them. There's some people who I describe as deep people, contemplative Christians. There are some people, though, who you would probably describe as shallow people. Shallow people are concerned with external things, like what's on the outside. What is a person wearing, or what is their status? How important are they? How important can I be? How much do I have or own? They're concerned with those kinds of external things. I said those are shallow people. But then there are deep people or contemplatives. The deep people in your lives, they're concerned not about the external things, the outside, the superficial things. They're concerned about things on the inside, what's going on inside your life and inside their life. The contemplative is concerned with things like, is there love in that soul? Are you a person who is generous and compassionate? Do you care about issues of justice? Those are the things that the contemplatives give themselves to. And so my invitation to you, like David says, he says, God, this is Psalm 119. He says, I meditate on your precepts day and night. David is after this pursuit of becoming a contemplative. So if you're going to embrace solitude, then start to practice contemplation. Okay, I have a third and final quarantine challenge for you, and it's this: to embrace simplicity. During this quarantine season, we've learned a lot of things about ourselves, right? We've learned especially that we can live with less, can't we? We've learned we can live with less entertainment. We can live with less sports. Who knew we could live without baseball and basketball? We've gone from March Madness to NBA players playing horse on ESPN. We've realized we can live with less entertainment, less eating out, less going to the movies. Everyone, I think, has learned about we can live without less entertainment, except people in Georgia, where bowling is still an essential activity, all right? But most of us have realized that we need to give ourselves to more important things. We don't need all of that. I think, secondly, we've learned that we can live with less stuff. We can make it with less things, haven't we? There's not so much shopping and buying anymore. No one cares about the new things that you've bought or purchased. No one cares so much about that because life has gotten real. What everyone cares about now is my family healthy? Will my family have enough to eat? Will I have a job? Will I get paid next week so I can pay my rent or my mortgage? We've realized we can live with less. So that's why I'm saying embrace simplicity. Going back to our story in Luke, when you look at verse 15, Jesus says this about the man. He says, he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. So he's addressing this temptation to acquire and accumulate. And he uses this very harsh word. He says, guard yourself against greed. And the challenge is for us to embrace simplicity, embrace austerity. This is one of the reasons that Paul Gunther and I invite so many of you at the Grove to go on global missions trips. Because when you go on a global missions trip, yes, you go and you make change in desperate places. We show people Jesus Christ. We pursue justice, but then God also does a work in your life. And I think one of the things that he does in our lives when we go somewhere else where people live in scarcity is that we learn to embrace simplicity. that we realize we don't need so much. In fact, every missions trip that I help to lead, I ban all kinds of things. I give people not a list of things they can bring. I give them a list of things they cannot bring, like granola bars, eat what's served to you, like fanny packs. It's just a bad fashion statement, in my opinion, those kinds of things. But there's a lot of things you realize you can live without. Philip Yancey, one of my favorite writers, writes about visiting a monastery in the Sinai Peninsula. And it was built by the Desert Fathers, like St. Catherine's. I don't know if you know, there's a number of monasteries that have been there for 1700 years, and they're still led by monks. So when he arrives, he said, a monk shows him to his room, and then before the monk leaves, he says, by the way, Mr. Yancey, if you need anything during your stay here, just let us know, and we'll show you how to live without it. And that's so true. I think we've learned today in this season that we can live with less. So embrace simplicity. We don't need so much anymore, do we? Why does Jesus talk so much and tell so many parables about money and possessions? Because he knew that our heart is connected to and our spiritual condition is connected to the things that we own and that we have. In the story, he says this, he says, what good is it if you gain the whole world, but you lose your soul? It feels good right now to not have to buy so many things. Can I just encourage you, when life gets back to normal again, would you keep living simply, keep embracing simplicity? I have a list of these come from Richard Foster in his Celebration of Disciplines, but he gives us a list of ways we can embrace simplicity. He says, one, only buy things for their usefulness, not because of their status. He says, two, deaccumulate, learn to let go. Three, enjoy God's creation more. It's free. Four, he says, reject any purchase, buying things that feed an addiction. And five, practice generosity. And that's the final practice that I want to invite you to. Because if the need is to embrace simplicity, then the practice that we need in our lives is to practice generosity. And now I'm saying that to so many of you at the Grove who are incredibly generous. And I want to say thank you for your generosity. But maybe this new season of living simply and living in austerity and scarcity, maybe it will free you up to be even more generous than before. Generosity, I think, is the antidote to stockpiling and accumulating. Generosity is the ultimate expression of simplicity. It takes the words, I will live simply, and it makes them real, puts them into practice. In verse 33, Jesus says this. Back to our parable in Luke 12. He says, sell your possessions and give to those in need. In this way, you will store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. And the purses of heaven never get old or develop holes. Your treasure will be safe. No thief can steal it. No moth can destroy it. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So Jesus says, take the things that I've given you. Convert your blessing into a blessing for others. He says, store up treasure in heaven. Stockpiling and accumulating, it's not what matters most. And so today I invite you to these spiritual practices, to begin living simply. Embrace that. Embrace this time that we're all going through right now. Form new spiritual practices and let God shape you. See this time as a blessing. Maybe even today, like I said, start to count your blessing. Write them down. Thank God for them. And then begin to practice contentment.